everybody, and welcome to the Marshall Hangout. This week, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Elaine Chard, who is from the FCDO, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And she has been in the FCDO for a while. I won't say how many years, it is in her bio, and is a specialist in human rights, and is going to be speaking to us today about what the Foreign Office is doing and what she does and anything else that she wants to talk to us about. In addition, we will be doing Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, usual process, just put your name in the chat and we'll call upon you. Given that it's quite a small group, if you could turn your cameras on, if you're happy to turn your cameras on, it would be nice, then Elaine does at least have somebody to talk to rather than a whole load of black squares. So I will hand over to Elaine. Thank you, Elaine.
Hi, thank you, Mary. Hi, everybody. I can't see any cameras on yet, but I'm sure you will. I'm in my 31st year of working for the Foreign Office. We are now actually Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which I will shorten to FCDO. And I'm absolutely delighted to be invited to talk about the UK government's work and foreign policy in terms of advancing human rights. I've actually been involved in my long career in the Foreign Office. First started in human rights post-Arab Spring. I joined the Egypt and Tunisia department, which was in London, and it was the response to what was happening out at the beginning of the Arab Spring, which you will remember started actually in Tunisia and was the beginning of a sort of people's revolt led by a market trader in Tunisia, but was basically an attempt to give the people their rights in a country, particularly in Tunisia, that they felt was corrupt, where they were not able to get on by their own merits and were and persecuted. So that was my first time of working. I led on political transition and human rights. And I have to say, by the time I finished the job, in terms of women's rights, it had actually got backwards rather than forwards. So not a particularly glowing part of my CV, but very, very interesting. I then moved on to working on counter-proliferation and nuclear weapons, which felt like, that the greatest right to human life and living where human rights have been invented, and what will we do about those, and then moved in December 2015 to leading on the Foreign Office policy on, so it was women's rights, equality, the rights of the child, rights of people with disabilities, LGBT rights, and Indigenous rights. Although in the UK we don't have any Indigenous people, we have to have policies for working in a multilateral fora. And I'm currently leading solely on LGBT plus rights. And so I just wanted to really set out the UK position on LGBT plus rights. So we have, the UK is seen as, and I realise that I'm speaking to US students, the UK and the US also have been seen as global leaders on LGBT plus rights. The UK is particularly active, whether it be from a bilateral perspective or the multilateral perspective. That's the approach that we have on all human rights, but specifically on LGBT rights, where the greatest barriers towards LGBT plus equality are around the ongoing violence and discrimination that's suffered by LGBT plus individuals globally, the fact that 69 countries actually criminalise same-sex conduct, and also the fact that there are about 11 countries where being LGBT plus could result in a death penalty. The screen has gone completely black. Is everybody still there?
We are still here. We can see you.
Okay, great. So the UK is very active in what we see as these human rights injustices. and work to that end. We also obviously respond to human rights violations. So, for example, in the Chechen region of Russia, where the authority there, or the governor, I can't quite remember what his name is, but basically there were some violations against LGBT individuals that were just carried out with impunity. And the UK has worked either at the UN, well, both at the UN through the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, to try to call Russia to account for these human rights violations. So we feel very strongly when any form of violations happen, but particularly I'm talking with the LGBT plus hat on, are carried out, and making sure that we respond with the appropriate response. I will say that the response can often be behind the scenes, where we will approach the government, the local government, to relay our concerns. So when I first started the job in Malawi, there were two men who were in a house and they were together, and the neighbours called the police and they got arrested and were being detained because same-sex conduct still is illegal there. And so our High Commissioner basically contacted the Minister for the Interior and said, look, these two men were minding their own business, and this is absolutely not the right thing to do. It wasn't a sort of gross indecency issue or an issue of something that's happening publicly, and working behind the scenes, work towards the release. So largely when it comes to a sensitive issue such as LGBT plus rights, we work behind the scenes. And I will add that in the Commonwealth, we have 35 Commonwealth countries that actually criminalise same-sex conduct. And obviously the UK has that, a lot of the laws that discriminate against LGBT plus individuals were put there by the UK. So this is something that is of a particular concern for us, because we do feel that level of responsibility. So the work that we do in the Foreign Office really does hinge all around the violations that exist, and the fact that LGBT plus rights are not honoured, and they are part of international human rights law. So all countries should uphold these rights, but unfortunately that does not always happen. And so that's the basis upon which we move forward with our work. The UK is currently the co-chair of something called the Equal Rights Coalition, and we are working in our co-chair partner is Argentina, and that was founded in 2016, August 2016, by a group of sort of about 32, 33 countries that were rather frustrated with the UN system, because the UN system has to take into account sort of dissenting voices. So let's say countries like Russia and Egypt, who will try to thwart what they see as Western attempts to push their values and ideology onto unwilling recipients. And so the Rights Commission was formed in 2016 as a sort of as a vehicle really to advance LGBTI equality outside of that space. So the UK took over the co-chair role in June 2019. It first started off with, the pairing, the two co-chairs should be a developed and a less developed country. The first pairing was the Netherlands and Uruguay. The second pairing was Canada with Chile, and currently it's UK working with Argentina. And it basically was formed as a vehicle to advance LGBT equality by working together with civil society organisations and other UN agencies, for example, UNAIDS or the UN Development Programme, to take that work outside of the UN and to advance it. When it started in 2016, the plan was that countries would work together as a coalition and share best practice, work quite closely together, but that hasn't really happened. So the Equal Rights Coalition hasn't really met its potential. And so when we took over in June 2019, we committed to drafting a strategy, a delivery of a strategy, which I've actually drafted, with a 5-year implementation plan that will set out exactly what we are going to do around the framework of addressing violence and discrimination, addressing ongoing criminalisation, and to actually even up and sharing of best practice to enable all of us countries who are members, and there are 42 countries now that are members, to improve and to advance LGBT plus equality. And to that end, the Equal Rights Coalition has a virtual conference on the 6th and 7th of July in an organisation which is called Wilton Park, which is the active agency of the FCDO, and it's like a stately home, but it's almost like a political think tank which looks at policy issues. And so we'll launch the strategy there, which we hope will be a jolt into the ERC by re-energising it with a clear framework for how the ERC is now going to organise itself, how it's going to work moving forward. And so, the plan is that we will then start to measure this and to measure progress and success. The one thing that I would add is that all attempts to advance LGBT plus equality are guided, so the FCDOs policy is that they are guided by civil society. So the civil society groups who operate in criminalising countries or any countries will always seek to inform our policy as to how to engage with host governments to make sure that whatever we do does no harm. So we have this clear policy of do no harm. So, for example, there's a UN day on the 17th of May called the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia. And our missions overseas will fly something called the rainbow flag. If local civil society think that flying the rainbow flag would incense the host government to such a degree that they would then have a crackdown on their LGBT plus citizens, or would just make their lives more difficult, we will listen to them and not do it. So our policy is very much informed by local grassroots civil society organisations. Our missions engage very heavily local CSOs, very happily, because they do help to inform our policy and our activities. But just one example, in Uganda, an activist there was saying that it's a criminalising country. He is often arrested because he's a gay man. But he found that because the High Commission in Kampala had invited him to a reception to mark the Queen's birthday, so we have the annual Queen's birthday party, QBP, because he'd been invited and was able to rub shoulders with people he didn't normally have access to, he actually ended up with the police commissioner's telephone number on speed dial. So he found that when he did get arrested, and he still got arrested, he could phone him and then get released. So for the cost of the UK government giving the activist a couple of glasses of wine or whatever, it's changed his life. And I think that we often have stories like this where we are able to listen and be guided by local activists and help and support them as much as we can in a way that will help them, because the activist is working towards criminalisation in Uganda, and that helps to meet our objectives too. And then the other thing that I wanted to just mention is that one of the responsibilities of the Equal Rights Coalition co-chair is to host an international conference. And although we're having our virtual conference that launches the strategy next month, that's quite a closed shop. It's really more about making the coalition stronger. It's not really kind of necessarily open to other countries, or maybe it would be open to the countries probably if they wanted to join the ERC. But we will actually host an in-person convening in London in June 2022, which is an international conference which will bring together And it will also have a focus on UK domestic LGBT plus policies, but it will be a convening of all stakeholders that will look at what are the issues facing LGBT plus equality, and what are we as the UK government, as the Equal Rights Coalition, what are we going to do as action points to address those issues. So that's something else that we're working towards. I think that's pretty much my headline stuff, and I realise I've been talking for about 20 minutes. Is there anything that you feel like I could cover more, or does anybody have any questions? I'd be really happy to answer them.
If you just stick your name in the chat, we can call on you to unmute. Katie.
Hi, yes, no, thank you so much for the great overview of it's very interesting to hear about kind of how these processes work and stuff. And so I was actually curious on that last point that you just made about drafting action points and strategies and stuff. And I'm just kind of curious, what are those action points, and how does that work at the international level? What sorts of things, especially because I imagine that's complicated, coordinating across governments, what are reasonable things to write into a strategy?
That's a really good question. So yeah, drafting the strategy, it's probably the biggest headache ever. But one of the main problems we have is that the Equal Rights Coalition hasn't really got on its legs. So the potential is that we're all going to talk to each other and share best practice and join forces, whether that be what we're doing in response to a resolution at the UN, or whether it be in response to a human rights violation, and hasn't really sort of. So the strategy was really more about started almost from a capacity building perspective of what can we put in place to have mechanisms where we can start to share best practice, but also to kind of more of that kind of UN language of urging our member states to do specific things, which will be around joining forces with us on particular issues. So the strategy is actually drafted in. So the Equal Rights Coalition was set up to address violence and discrimination and ongoing criminalisation. So the strategy is kind of broken down that way, plus with a kind of section on capacity building. So it's more along the lines of we need all of these things to be happening at the same time. What I would say is that post-COVID, funding for LGBT plus projects is a real issue for lots of governments and members of the ERC, because most of the members of the Equal Rights Coalition are, there are like-minded, but they're pretty good on LGBT plus rights anyway. And so most countries, so for example, the UK has had to reduce our overseas aid budget because of the cost of our vaccine rollout program. And so I think it's just trying to be aware of, when I started drafting it, we didn't have COVID, and then now we need more kind of things that don't cost lots of money, rather than saying let's all pile a load of money into a pot to solve X, Y, and Z problem. And it's just really about how can we address these particular issues. So for example, in addressing violence and discrimination, it's going to urge all of our member states to ban conversion therapy. So conversion therapy is it's actually, I think we view it as torture in reality, but it's usually around religion, where you would go and your faith might say, so you think you're gay, and you have a phrase which is called pray the gay away, but it can range from something about praying, or it can be something which is far more physical or mentally damaging. So that's just one example of what's included in there. So it's quite tentative, but it's trying to get all of the states to be at kind of at the starting line together, and let's just kind of check progress. So the 5-year strategy is going to be broken down into 12-month bite-sized chunks where we can just gauge progress against those actions. Does that help?
Yes, no, thank you very much.
Kevin, you have a question.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really interesting. And obviously being Pride Month, I think it's very topical. I'm a historian and I studied the Balkans, and many Balkan member states, as well as Eastern European states, are part of the EU, which obviously the UK has just left. And with Brexit, obviously comes the loss of like certain types of ways to engage with the Union. However, now as a different kind of partner, there are new ways in which the UK can kind of apply pressure and seek to influence EU domestic policy. And it's honestly been very scary to see the backsliding with gay rights in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. I mean, Poland is obviously very famously a dangerous place for, gay people and queer people. Hungary just had gay film showing stormed by anti-gay activists. There's just a lot of violence. I lived for a year in North Macedonia, which is a candidate country, and there's not a single gay bar in the capital. There's just so much violence that people face daily. And coming from the American South, it's an issue that's very near and dear to me. Obviously, there are parallels to the experience. And I'm interested in, obviously building on the strategy question, how the UK maybe would seek to honor these commitments to LGBTQ rights with its new relationship to the EU, seeing that the EU is really struggling in this regard, especially with members who are in the East and in the Balkans.
That's another really good question. So basically, yes, we've left the European Union, but we're still a very active member of the Council of Europe. So what we have in the Council of Europe is something called the European Focal Network, which is a grouping where we share best practice, and that's domestic best practice with a view to advancing LGBT+ equality. So that's one tool that we are particularly active on. And very recently, to mark Ida Hobbit Day, we had UK hosted a forum which looked at the issues facing LGBT+ equality and what we could do in terms of sharing domestic best practice to advance that. The problem is, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your name and it's not up here. What's your name? Sorry.
Oh, my name is Kevin.
Kevin, right, Kevin. So what the issue is, it's always the way, is that the countries that we need to talk to won't talk to us. So you aren't going to Hungary and Poland, they're going to sit in a Council of Europe forum to sit and share best practice on these issues because they are absolutely not committed to this agenda whatsoever. So what we have in the UK is our programme work, where so the last financial year we funded a program that was tackling hate crime in the Balkans. It was actually the Balkans and Turkey, where we are advancing so we advanced the work there, and we funded an app that individuals could have in these countries, and it's actually now going to link into Vodafone. I think they're going to take it off us. But it was delivered by Stonewall, and it is basically if somebody is encountering hate crime, they press they press this app, or they alert using this app, and then seek assistance. And that was actually something when I worked on the Egypt desk, we funded for women in Egypt who would attend rallies and then would suddenly find themselves being subject to sexual violence and all manner of decency. So that app is something that we kind of, it's a bit of like a card that we play, but it seems to have gone down very well there, and we're seeking to advance that. My husband is Greek, and my first overseas posting was Athens, where I went to loads and loads of gay bars because they were always the best to go. But Greece, a bit like the Balkans, there are some issues around hate crime even there. So it feels as if that's a problem that's absolutely, it's a global problem without a doubt. But I think that when we are aware of particular areas, regions like that, we do try to address it. North Macedonia has just recently joined the Equal Rights Coalition. So we are particularly keen to engage with North Macedonia, and I know that North Macedonia is really keen on EU accession. So there's a lot to think of. But yeah, I can't really answer your question because in view of Hungary's activity yesterday, where they passed further legislation which will limit what they call minors under 18s access to what they think will be homosexual liquor is very worrying. And so again, we are working behind the scenes and we're trying to work out what we can do in response to that. But you know, the like Orban in Hungary and in Poland, they just EU, it's almost they're powerless to stop them from our perspective, despite the fact that the EU has got a strategy to advance LGBT plus equality. It's just Hungary and Poland won't join it, so it's difficult. I think, in my personal opinion, this is not the UK government, it's my view, they just really need to say, if you want to be a member of this club, you have to follow these rules. It's as simple as that. But
yeah, and that's always been the frustrating thing with member countries wanting to join for the economic benefits, but really not being on board with the civic values of the EU, which obviously, you know, the UK was one of the folks who really tried to set the foundation there. So yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. It was a really thoughtful answer. I remember actually a Greek girl when I was on tour in Budapest, she was wearing pride flags and there was a nationalist protest going on. The tour guide had to say to her, like, please take that off. Like, you will face violence right now. They're coming down the street if you don't. And it's just such an intense, like, visceral, real reality. And I hope that obviously the ways in which the EU is kind of powerless was one of the reasons why the UK kind of navigated its way out. And maybe this new chapter is an opportunity to do some good work, because obviously UK will remain a part of Europe regardless of the formal institutional ties. But I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Yeah.
So other Katie, sorry, I should have been specific when I said Katie earlier.
It's all right. I figured from the order in the chat how we'd play out. Thank you again for this talk. This was super fascinating. So unlike Kevin, I am definitely not a policy person, so apologies if this is a bit of a basic question. But I'm curious about the way that like domestic progress and regress affect what you're able to do on the international stage. So like I'm thinking of the example of some relatively recent like losses in access to gender affirming healthcare for trans kids in the UK. How does that affect either like credibility or willingness or ability to advocate for trans rights abroad? Just like generally, how does that work for you guys?
Oh, Katie, I love you group. You're all asking questions that are like uppermost in my mind. So yes. So I had recently to provide an update to FCDO ministers on real concerns that we had, particularly if we're going to have an international conference in 2022, that the UK's domestic or perceptions around UK domestic policies were not where they should be. So I absolutely agree with you. So I think the UK's, so in 2017, the UK launched a national survey and it had something like 107,000 responses to LGBT individuals that were explaining their lived experiences of living in the UK and basically what they wanted. It was almost like a sheet of like, you just tell us what you want. And then in 2018, the UK launched a national action plan that had 1 page of international elements in it. There's a national action plan which actually contains 75 actions that the UK government were committed to helping to improve the lives of our LGBT plus citizens. But unfortunately, the action plan has not delivered, it has not performed as well as it should have done. And so there's certainly a perception, particularly in the current climate in the UK, that the UK is back on LGBT plus rights, notably in one entry in the National Action Plan around the Gender Recognition Act. So we currently have a Gender Recognition Act, which for everybody else, if you don't know what I'm talking about, is basically for a transgender person to change their gender, so that you basically say, I no longer want to be this gender, I'm going to change my gender. You do not have to go through surgery in order to do this. You would just basically have a new birth certificate. So you have a birth certificate in your new chosen gender, and that's how you proceed with your life. So the Gender Recognition Act, which in the UK, I think we had ours was in something like 2014, was actually really seen as really groundbreaking. But there was certain perception that within the National Action Plan, it was going to be reformed and it was going to be really forward-leaning. and that just hasn't happened. So the UK has taken an awful lot of flack for that. And I think on the second issue around conversion therapy, where the government, from a domestic perception, said, you know, we're going to ban conversion therapy, and then they started dithering around whether they were going to completely ban all forms of conversion therapy or whether they were going to allow some forms of conversion therapy where you could have some spiritual guidance or something like that. Because for us in the FCDO, the bottom line is anything that's going to come to you that says you need help because you're LGBT is not accepted. And so the UN's independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity has been very clear in all his reports that every country must ban all forms of conversion therapy. So again, the UK has dithered over this and has now gone back. So they're just about to announce we're going to have another period of consultation. It's like, what's to consult on, you know? So to answer your question, this has really impacted on us internationally. We've had a few international society organisations asking the UK to step down as the ERC co-chair, basically saying that we're not a safe pair of hands to take this forward. So we really have had a lot of problems as a result of what's happening domestically. So we are frantically trying to claw that back. We are trying to influence domestically. And so the Prime Minister in the UK around Ida Hobbit, so around the 16th of May, appointed a special envoy on LGBT equality, and he is actually going to look at domestic and international policies. So it's his job to kind of put it straight, really, and get it all fixed. So I hope that answers your question, because it's a huge problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else have any questions, anything they'd like to ask? I think this has been really fascinating. It's a really good insight into how governments can do things and influence things. And you know, things have moved on. The anecdote I remember is the one about in how when there wasn't gay marriage wasn't allowed in Australia, and you could go to the British High Commission and get married at the British High Commission, which I thought was an amazing solution to something.
That's a good point. Yeah, so we've been offering same-sex marriage in many of our missions, not all of them, in many of our missions for quite a few years now. So yeah, it's very popular. Yeah, I don't have the stats on the numbers, but very popular.
I just think it was a great thing. Jayantha, you've got a question.
Hi, and I'm so sorry I joined late because I was having some incredibly annoying and frustrating technical issues. So I'm very sorry about that. But I'm really excited about what I've heard so far. And I have a question that I hope hasn't already been asked, but I work at the Carter Center in Atlanta, and we do a lot of work around human rights and human rights defenders, including kind of protection and networking of human rights defenders. And I wanted to know from your perspective, especially in terms of those who are focusing on promoting and protecting LGBT rights overseas, what you think are some of the best ways or some of the most important things to consider when looking at that sort of kind of networking and protection of those defenders.
And that's a really great question. Thank you very much. I think, you know, UK policy is that we put the views of civil society, human rights defenders, that I will call civil society, but human rights defenders, all of them, up front in our policy making. Our overseas missions will always invite in local civil society, human rights defenders, to discuss human rights issues, and it could be issues that are happening in that host country, or it could be other broader issues. And our overseas network of posts seem to absolutely relish the task speaking to LGBT plus civil society, which is great. So it's not much of an ask. They're also very happy to. So civil society will often say that what they really appreciate is that we will visibly show our support by marking international the days like the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia, Ida Hobbit, on the 17th of May. So the UK missions largely will fly the rainbow flag. Pre-COVID, we would host tea parties or roundtables or events, but we'd invite them in, dialogue, and they all really appreciated it and saw it as a really, really important as part of their recognition and their voice. I think the other thing is, I don't know if you caught the section that the UK is the co-chair of the Equal Rights Coalition, and we have a huge space. So that's a grouping of currently 42 countries working towards LGBTI equality. And we have a huge space in there for civil society. They're always beating us with verbal sticks on, you know, you haven't done this, or this not quick enough. Have you thought about this? So our policy has always been to listen to civil society, to work very closely with human rights defenders. They are a very, very valuable part of our work. If you look at a country, so at the moment, 69 countries that criminalise same-sex conduct, it is the local civil society groups that are actively working towards breaking that down and working towards changing the institution. Governments, if the UK government comes in and says, oh, we think you can do whatever, it's like white noise, they won't listen. But the civil society groups are the ones that are really taking that action forward. So they are a vital part of every element of our human rights policy work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrew, you have a question.
Hi, yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. So you mentioned earlier when you were discussing kind of like creating these action points that you've had difficulty recently because the UK government has had to cut its foreign aid budget. And so you haven't really been able to come up with action points that were related to or would require substantial sums of money. And I was wondering, just more generally, how do you navigate a situation like that as a civil servant who's kind of subject to budgetary constraints, especially at a time when it seems like there's a lot of pressure on larger governments from more developed nations to provide more foreign aid to other countries. Like, I know there's a lot of pressure on President Biden right now to sort of quote unquote vaccinate the world in the US media. And so I'm wondering, just like, how do you approach issues like these when you're subject to sort of higher constraints that you don't have within your control?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me personally, because of all of the years of building up really strong and professional relationships with our civil society contacts, and that will be international groups who are based in the UK but operate internationally, and also our contacts with our overseas network of posts. I think what I've done this time is to basically say the overseas development assistance, our aid budget has dropped from 0.7 to 0.5, is to basically say, I'm really sorry, this is what we're working with. But a couple of things that have happened this year is that amazingly, although the ODA allocation for LGBT plus projects it's actually stayed the same as last year, but other projects have been cut. I have had access to non-ODA funding. So I've tapped into this pot, and we're all sort of thinking creatively as to how we can use this money. And so again, have just gone out to them and said, I'm really sorry, but the ODA recipient countries, which is, a lot of the Commonwealth and a lot of the countries that you would want to operate in on LGBT plus policy work, because they're the ones that need it, we won't be able to have that high level of ambition. But can we think more creatively with this non-ODA money, which moves more into things like research, where we can use that because it doesn't directly benefit an ODA eligible country. So I think they've quite enjoyed the challenge of, we don't have that, but we have this. But what the kind of sweetener as such has been, because we've got this conference in 2022, we must have a large funding announcement make then, so that it's been kind of packaged by me as a short-term blip, and that we should just get back to normal in the next financial year. So having the conference, or into 2022, so having the conference is really useful for that, because almost pretty much say yes, you'll get the funding back. So I think, to answer your question, it's partly, number one, having really good and trusting relationships where they're going to say, yeah, she's doing her absolute best for us, and she's found this other source of funding that we're going to tap into and use creatively. And number two, you know, this is just for this financial year, and then next year we'll just do what we always plan to do. And maybe with even more money, hopefully we'll get a big funding announcement. So I think we're quite lucky, because other countries perhaps won't have that, but I think we're pretty lucky. But yeah, I get your point with the US. And I suppose prior to the Biden administration, my US colleagues, I would say, I don't know how you're able to achieve so much. You do so much. They were so, you know, open and committed to Equal Rights Coalition, and they just said that they would just have to fly below the radar, which I thought was a wonderful expression for what they effectively did have to do. So it seems that that they've just got a completely different, I mean, you know, we've seen Biden's announcements on LGBT+ rights since, which is just absolutely great to hear.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew.
Are there any other questions? Only a few who left who haven't asked questions. Anybody want to ask another question? Don't have to. No? Okay, well, Elaine, I think that's been really fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're very busy, so we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And I think it's really helped us, or certainly helped me, to further understand everything that is being done through the UK government, which I think is fantastic. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you everybody else for coming. And I look forward to seeing you all at future Hangouts, which she'll be sending out shortly. So thank you very much, Elaine.
No, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.